Episode 7 of Band of Brothers is titled Breaking Point, and this episode is one that long lives in the memory and comes to the forefront of my mind when I think of the show. Following on from episode 6, which was titled Bastogne, this episode followed Sergeant Lipton in a stylistically different type of episode which was still set inside of the Ardennes forest in Bastogne. This episode took the approach of allowing us to see inside of Lip's mind and almost hearing his perspective of the events that occurred and the end of the tether that many of the men were coming to, almost as if it were like diary entries. With this episode being titled Breaking Point, we saw these men quite literally at their breaking point as death, poor leadership, harsh conditions, and the loss of the men from the company was pushing them to their limits. Whether that be Buck Compton, Hoobler, Lipton, Guarnere, Toye, or Winters. So let's not wait any longer and let's dive right into the episode and break down all that there was to take away from it. Here is a breakdown of Band of Brothers episode 7. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. The interviews. Like all of the episodes, this one kick-started with interviews from 4 of the veterans from Easy Company. We had Richard Winters, Daryl Shifty Powers, Joe Lesniewski, and Donald Malarkey. Considering this was a very long episode, it felt like it was the shortest batch of interviews that we had. The topic of what they were talking about was something which connected extremely well to the title of the episode, which was Breaking Point. These men that were being interviewed were talking about their time in the Ardennes forest and the mindset that they had and how they were on the cusp of breaking point. It was very condition focused and centered around the death that was present. The death of friends and how that was something which altered the mindsets of many of the people that were there. When it was said how the men were surrounded by death, whether that be their own men, civilians, enemy troops, and even animals, you can't even begin to imagine the weight of what that does to a person. Being surrounded by the very thing that you fear most and knowing that it could so easily be you lying there being that person that was dead in the blink of an eye must take its toll. These interviews were ones which were some of the most emotional ones to watch, especially when it got to the section with Malarkey. He was on the cusp of tears and was mentioning how whilst he was there, when friends went down it was too difficult to be able to care for them in the way that one usually might, and how later on in life he'd still remember what happened and the people that he lost and that it would come back and get him. As he said this, he was in tears before it faded to black. This was a particularly powerful moment because later on in the episode we saw that Malarkey went on to lose 3 of his good friends within the company in a matter of hours. So this line and the emotion that the real-life Donald Malarkey was feeling hit even harder after going through the episode and understanding even more why he felt the way that he did. This opening section of the interviews really did set the tone and lean into the harsh, unforgiving conditions and the mindset that many of the men had at that point. The fact that it was taking its toll mentally and physically, and in January of 1945 they were at their breaking point whilst inside of Bastogne. The interviews are such a strong part of the show, having the real heroes there being able to tell their story even in just snippets. It always complements what we eventually go on to see, and it allows us to be able to connect what they've said to the story that we see developing. It's just perfect, and I'm so glad that from a creative point of view, the showrunners decided to take that approach. When the episode then opened up, we saw that it was January the 2nd, 1945. The events that we saw taking place in episode 6 in Bastogne were around Christmas time, so this episode was set quite literally only a matter of days later after General Patton's Third Army broke through the German lines and rescued the 101st Airborne Division, something that the 101st State wasn't necessary and felt that they didn't need. At this point, Easy were being called upon to push the Germans through the bulge and clear the woods near Foy for the eventual assault that would be taking place on Foy on the 13th of January. Within this opening section, the tone and mood was set for the remainder of the episode by one of the first things that we saw taking place. This was the death of Hoobler. Hoobler had this long-running mission of his to be able to get his hands on a Luger, and during this opening section, he killed a German soldier that was on horseback, and when he went over and searched the man, he got his hands on a Luger that he'd been desiring since before he dropped on D-Day. The death of Hoobler was one that hit hard because it was one that wasn't caused by the enemy in an attack. It was just by accident. The Luger that Donald Hoobler had so desperately wanted to collect was the very thing that killed him. Once he had it, he put it in his pocket, but because he was wearing so much clothing because of the cold temperatures that they were facing, it caused the gun to go off and the bullet went into his leg which tore his femoral artery. Whilst what we saw in the show fit the narrative of Hoobler wanting a Luger, the real Donald Hoobler suffered a death that was similar but is considered to not necessarily be exactly the same. It's said that when Hoobler fired at the German soldier on horseback, he didn't actually kill him, and instead he was taken in as a prisoner. It's also said that the Luger didn't come from him, and it's questioned if he ever actually got his hands on one. On January the 3rd, Hoobler did die due to a gun going off in his pocket, but it's said that it could have been his own one due to the fact that it's questioned if he did actually get a Luger. However, it is also rumoured as well that it could have been a Luger, and because he was so excited to finally get his hands on one, he was messing around with it, and then once he put it in his pocket, it went off. Unlike in the show, Hoobler didn't die on the field, he actually died shortly after he got to an aid station. So although this part of the episode wasn't 100% accurate, it very much lent in on the ambiguity of his death and focused more on the Luger because that was the very thing that he wanted. The death of Hoobler was something which also showed us one key aspect of this episode. The fact that Sergeant Carl Lipton was there and prepared to be the leader that the company needed and wanted when they were being led astray and following a man who was considered to be incompetent, which was Lieutenant Dike. The way that Dike was portrayed is something that's actually really different to the real-life Norman Dike. Within this episode, Dike was absent for a lot of the planning and preparation that would be going on for the assault on Toye, which was on the 13th of January. He seemed extremely disinterested in what was going on, the men that were alongside him, the value of their lives, and the knowledge of how best to carry out the plan that was in place. So much so that it ultimately cost the lives of many of the men within Easy Company. However, the real-life Norman Dike wasn't incompetent at all. He actually carried out many acts of heroics. He was awarded a Bronze Star for his actions in Holland, a second Bronze Star for his acts in Bastogne, where he removed 3 wounded members of his company from an exposed position, all whilst they were under intense fire. This isn't the way that Dike was delivered to us in the episode, so it is really strange that they decided to do that. I'm going to presume that they did this because when it actually came to the assault on Toye on the 13th of January, Carl Lipton said that it seemed like Dike had almost fallen apart. Dike had apparently been wounded, and it was the wound that caused him to stop in his tracks. He wasn't paralysed with fear like was depicted in the show, but his wound almost took him back. So the falling apart of the assault on Toye in the show and the behaviour of Dike is most likely because of that. Winters himself didn't actually speak that highly of Dike either, nor did many of the other men in the company. He was apparently disinterested, like depicted, and he'd often disappear and spend his time in a foxhole rather than fighting. This was something that meant that he earned the nickname Foxhole Norman, so the show did apply the creative license with this character, but there were truths that were embedded all throughout it. One thing that this episode showed us as well, which was in complete contrast to Dike, was the loyalty and commitment that many of the other men had. For example, Joe Toye had just returned from being at an aid station, but he couldn't stand the thought of not being alongside the men that he was there with and fighting alongside them. This showed that they'd quite literally do anything for one another when it came to being on the field. So much so that when Joe Toye did eventually return, he got hit and lost his leg. He didn't have to be there at that moment, but he chose to be. Plus, with Guarnere also being hit and losing his leg when he went to rescue his buddy, the level of commitment to one another and also showing that they were prepared to help and do what they could when Dike took the approach of running away and leaving for help, it was just the polar opposite. The true camaraderie and loyalty was something which cut through and showed that even with a leader that was incompetent and at breaking point himself, they could still find a way to function. This is all because Easy Company was created and built in a way where there was a togetherness and a deep core understanding of one another and how to fight through and survive under the toughest of situations. There was a moment which had some foreshadowing in the early parts of the episode. Over the course of the past couple of episodes, Buck had been a shell of the person that he was before he got wounded during Operation Market Garden, and the broken nature of the man reached its peak in this episode. We saw that he was going around to many of the men and saying that they shouldn't do anything stupid because after seeing what happened to Hoobler, he didn't want to face any more death. This led Heffron to say that he reminded him of somebody that was crazy. With Buck eventually seeing Guarnere and Toye, his 2 good friends lying there, both missing a leg, he stood up, took off his helmet and just stared at them. He looked like he'd finally reached his breaking point and there was no way back for Buck Compton after that point. So much so that we saw that he was taken off the line and evacuated for Trenchford, but realistically it was because of the mindset that he had and the effect of seeing his 2 closest friends lying there after being hit. Buck actually said in his autobiography, "Although I was affected by the horrors of Bastogne, I don't believe I was clinically shell-shocked as the series portrays me. Instead, he thought that it felt like the Germans were really going to get them at that point, showing that he felt like there was no way out at that moment. With Lipton narrating over the top, we saw that even though Compton was evacuated due to his mindset not being in the right place, there were no levels of respect that were lost for him. Because prior to that, he gave it his all and put the safety and well-being of the men that he served alongside as the top priority. Again, a stark difference to that of Lieutenant Dike. There was a part of this episode where it was said how fear was like a disease and a poison. It was something that could spread around and become contagious. So when fear was present amongst men, they'd often take them off the line, not for the bettering of themselves, but mainly for the bettering of the company and the unit. Because if fear started spreading, it opened up a weakness and killed the mentality that the men had. This was shown to us mainly through Malarkey and the fact that it lost 3 of his good friends over the space of a 24-hour window, showing that even being placed a few hundred meters back from the line, it could change somebody's mindset completely and make them just feel that bit more relaxed. One moment that I thought was so heartbreaking to watch in this episode was when Toye was lying there and just shouting, "I gotta get up," as he was dragging himself across the ground. The emotion and panic that was in his voice was delivered through the screen so well, and you couldn't help but feel the pain that he was in and the loneliness and vulnerability whilst being out there in the open. Another character that we saw getting a key focus in this episode was Spears. The rumours of what he did on D-Day were still going strong when it came to the gunning down of the German POWs. Spears is a cold individual in the show. He's as cold and harsh as the snow that settled on the ground in Bastogne. But what I liked about this ongoing rumour was that he saw the value in having that image imprinted inside of everybody's mind. The fear and ambiguity that it gave them of him. The men didn't know what to think, and it garnered some kind of respect amongst them because he was perceived to be like a loose cannon. With Spears also getting involved during the assault on Foy due to it not going as planned because Dike wasn't prepared and wasn't following the orders from Winters due to him freezing up and panicking. The machine that is Spears was shown to us, and the fact that he just walked into oncoming fire and was committed and intelligent. It tied back to what he said to Blythe in episode 3 of the show, where he said how in order to function there you have to have already accepted your fate, and that was that you're already dead. It's something that you can see that he followed within his own mind within the show, and it was crucial to the assault on Foy, because if Winters hadn't sent him in to relieve Dike of command, then who knows what would have happened. It's actually said that it was a coincidence that Spears was the person that went in to relieve Dike, as apparently Spears was just the first person that was there when Winters turned. What we saw Spears do in the show was something which did actually occur in reality. He wanted to alter what Dike had ordered the men to do, but he wasn't able to link up with Item Company because they had no radio. So instead, he ran through the German line and informed the company of the changed plans. Having done that, he then ran back through the town and ultimately led the company to victory. This was something which meant that he then became the commanding officer of Easy Company, like we saw in the show, and he remained in that position until the end of the war, being the longest serving commander of Easy. Now, with regards to the main person that we followed in the episode, that was Carl Lipton, and his involvement in this episode is one of the main reasons as to why it's so good. Like I mentioned during the start of the video, being able to hear inside of his mind and having him narrate through every moment just allowed us to look inside the mind of a person and understand exactly what he was going through. Whether that be the distaste towards Dike and the fear that he'd vocalized to Winters, where he genuinely thought that Foy would be a failure and that Dike would cost the lives of men, the somewhat light-heartedness of relating a shellacking to the 4th of July fireworks, but also the commitment and care that he had to the men that weren't even his responsibility. Lipton was the epitome of the perfect person to have truly led the company in their time of need when Dike was there. He garnered respect from the men, cared for them, they cared for him, and he had a strong head on his shoulders. This was best shown to us when he ran through Foy when the sniper was waiting to take out the men that previously thought they were successful, risking his own life so that a shot could be aimed towards the sniper, with Spears speaking to Lipton at the end and saying how the men felt as though Lipton was the one person that they could count on, that had essentially been the unofficial CO of Easy Company. It concluded with him being told that he was getting promoted to lieutenant. This one singular frame here of Lipton, just looking in complete shock, spoke 1,000 words. There was fear, relief, devastation, death, but such strength. The strength that showed that even amongst the toughest of times coming out the back end of Bastogne, he fought through his own breaking point and found a way to survive and be that leader that they all needed. He was relieved that he survived, but he was broken because of the deaths. As he said, 145 men from the company went there and only 63 were leaving, so there were heavy losses that were suffered for sure. The final scene that we had in the episode was one that was very light-hearted, and I thought that was the right approach. We had such a heavy episode that was one of the darkest in the series, but right at the end we saw that Luz was joking and thanking the boys for leaving feces in their foxholes. Plus, we also saw Lipton taking a cigarette, showing that he was a changed man. Lipton wasn't a smoker, but the events of Bastogne had made him one. This showed the ordeal that he went through, and it almost symbolized that no man was the same leaving Bastogne compared to when they arrived. My review of the episode. I thought this episode of Band of Brothers was truly remarkable. It's one of the best ones for sure. Bastogne and Breaking Point are two episodes that really do complement each other so well and sit on their own in the show. From a stylistic approach, this episode felt so different to many of the other episodes that were in the show. The fact that it was presented to us like diary entries by hearing what Lipton was going through was a really creative way of allowing us to understand firsthand a bit more about what would have been going on through the characters' minds. Having Dike being this figure in the episode that was so different to everybody else within Easy, and seeing how even men that were so many ranks below him were braver, more loyal, and more personable really allowed characters like Lipton and Spears to shine and understand what made them so heroic. There were some really emotional moments in this episode, such as everything that went on with Buck, Toye and Guarnere, but also right at the beginning with Hoobler. It was just so unexpected, and it showed a different side to death in war, showing that things can just happen by accident, and a lack of attention can be a killer sometimes. Even though this episode is the longest, along with the first episode, it didn't feel like it at all. It absolutely flew by, and I just felt so immersed within it. I genuinely feel like Bastogne is the most immersive part of Band of Brothers. You feel the suffering, the temperature, the lack of supplies, the men being killed, and the lowering of morale. It's genuinely one of my favourite parts of the entire series because it feels so real. With the episode being titled Breaking Point, it really did feel like these men were at their breaking point, and everything that they'd gone through had started to take its toll on them. The connection to the interviews at the start of the episode was something which I think was at its strongest in this episode because of the emotion that was present on all of them, and the heavy subject which was death. They were essentially operating in a graveyard, and you can really understand how that would alter the mindset of a man. This is definitely one of the better episodes in the show. They're all great, but this one is just up there for me. Always has been, and I think always will be. With the last patrol being episode 8, that again is an episode that feels really tense in its approach, and it's quite an intense episode too, so I'm looking forward to delving into that one next week. So, there you have it, a breakdown of Band of Brothers episode 7. I just want to say I'm really sorry that this video took so long. It was an episode that I was really looking forward to covering, but there's been a lot of shows that have been getting released and it just kept conflicting with me working on this video. But I'll get working on my episode 8 breakdown very soon. If you want to see more videos on Band of Brothers, then click on the card in the top corner. Or alternatively, you can head over to my channel where you'll find a breakdown of every episode of the show. I'm covering Band of Brothers and I'll be moving on to the Pacific after, so be sure to stick around for that too. What did you think of episode 7? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, thanks for tuning into the video and I'll see you in the next one.